Flood Season, the third adventure in the Shackled City campaign. This adventure was originally published in 3rd edition, specifically Dungeon Magazine number 98, although it was republished in the Shackled City campaign book with some alterations throughout the adventure for different creatures and some of the traps. Now, this adventure was written by James Jacobs with artwork by Stephen Danielle, Peter Berting, Scott Fisher, and cartography by Christopher West. This adventure begins in the city of Cauldron, which sits in the mouth of a dormant volcano, and again is the third adventure in the series, although the DM could run it as the second adventure as well, depending on if the DM ran the second adventure, which is called Drakthar's Way, which wasn't in Dungeon Magazine again. I did do a video on it, but it was in the campaign book for Shackled City, so it's a hard one to come by. This adventure is probably a slightly better adventure than the original adventure, Life's Bizarre. Throughout this video, I'll explain why, and we'll start here. This is the first page, technically the second. The first image you'll find, by the way, is this image of the villain in the story. Her name is Triel Eldarast. She's a priestess and fighter or warrior of Hextor. She was a member of the city guards who committed murder in the city like 10 years before. She follows a god of conflict and tyranny, known for having 6 arms, her deity that is, and being a god of discord. Now, if you share this image with your player characters, keep in mind it is a risque image, and it does depict her as wearing some plate mail. She is described as wearing full plate, but as you can see by the image, if you go by this description, she is not fully armed and armored in full plate. So if you go by that, show her in or lower her armor class a bit and explain that she has only partial plate, or you can just skip the image, show her some basic information if you don't feel like that image will work and would be appropriate for your campaign. It does show her as being more sinister, but some DMs might feel like it would be too seductive for their campaign. It's really up to the DM's preference and whether the players are okay with an image like that. Now, this adventure begins with the player characters once again interacting and being summoned by Genya Eurakis, the ranking priestess of St. Cuthbert in the city, although she's not the high priest. He does come into play in this adventure, which leads to her becoming the de facto high priest or high priestess. Now, essentially, as we're going on here, and I can show you some further images, here's the city of Cauldron with some of its locations. Note, some of these locations do come into play in the prior adventures, but some of them also come into play in this adventure, or I would recommend adding them into play for different reasons and at different parts of the adventure, like having the players look for healing potions at the various temples, like the Temple of Lordly Might, the Temple of Cord, or stopping over at Weir's Elixirs to talk to Vortimax Weir's, and buying potions from him. There are different NPCs throughout this campaign from many of those locations that can be quite useful. I would also recommend them stopping, or at least attempting to stop, the largest temple in the city, the Church of Wee Joss, which will be a part of one of the latter adventures in this series. So it sets up a lot of things that are going to happen. And it also gives the DM a lot of sort of downtime side adventures to do or side activities that you could do in this adventure. Again, you might see this map on the right, by the way, which shows some of the underground passages under the city. Most of these you, as a DM, probably won't be using, although there's one or two of them that do come into play. Essentially, like you do go under the city in this adventure. Now, when the players begin this adventure, as I said, they're summoned by Genya Eurakis. She was an NPC introduced in the first adventure, which is Life's Bizarre by Chris Perkins. And she is more of a reoccurring ally to the player characters, and likely the player characters will go to the Temple of St. Cuthbert quite a lot in this campaign, may even use it as a base. Now, her High Cleric has recently been returning to Cauldron and has made it to the Lucky Monkey Inn, which is about a day away from Cauldron to the west. He it sent an alarming sending spell. His name, by the way, is Sarkim, and he's carrying several wands of control water. Now, these are items from third edition that essentially do exactly what they say. They allow the wielder to control water, in this case, the water level of the central lake. This adventure is called Flood Season, by the way, for a reason. Now, these are not items that are in fifth edition. You can make, if you're running in fifth edition, you can alter the items to be, like a normal, like rare wand, which would probably be sufficient. That could be used maybe 5 times per day. And they would be, quite valuable, but they're more valuable in Cauldron because of the situation here. That's why he was out of the city, probably in, I think there's a nearby port city to the north, it's like Seldarine or something like that. And, he's coming back for a reason. But he sends an alarming sending spell to Genya Arrakis, and noting that he is in danger and something has happened at the Lucky Monkey. And so she frantically hires the player characters or summons them to her temple to speak with her about what's happening as the weather is growing worse in Cauldron. I'll note it's winter in Cauldron, and Cauldron takes place high in the mountains, but it takes place in the southern latitudes, so it doesn't get a lot of snow or anything like that, but it does get a lot of rain in the rainy season. Thus, again, flood season. I'll note, by the way, this adventure has two notable villains. One is a were-baboon berserker by the name of Tongue Eater. He's kind of interesting in that fact that he's not a were-rat or a werewolf. He's a were-baboon, which fits the setting because there are a lot of, baboons and monkeys. You might even throw flying monkeys in as well. I did my campaign in this vicinity, in this area. It's notable that this area also has dinosaurs as a main type of creature that could be encountered in the area. But Tongue Eater is a good sub boss or secondary boss that shows up after the first segment of the adventure. And then secondary boss, or the main boss, is Triel Elderast again. And I would introduce her fairly early in the adventure. I mean, at least by name. Maybe some of the players, if they're a member of the city guards, they might know her name by reputation. It could be that you have a player character who's, if he or she is human, that their character is related to her. Maybe she's a distant cousin or something like that. It'd be a great way to tie her into the adventure, especially the fact that she has betrayed the city of Cauldron, more or less, and is causing havoc in the city. Well, as the players get to their meeting with Genya Arrakis, let me go down here. Here's some basic information in third edition, by the way, for converting different creatures or really switching them out, which some of this can be used, by the way, like replacing the harpoon spider, which was originated in this adventure, with a half dragon monster spider. There's a lot of half dragons in third edition. It's interesting. A lot of these creatures are in fifth edition, although there are a few exceptions like the Kopru and the Mudslade. Many of these creatures can be found online. The Skolven, for example, I did a 5e conversion for it, which you can find on Dungeon Masters Guild, but it also includes a top-down PNG file, so you can use it as a creature that I drew based on the actual design of the creature. But the rest of these creatures you can either find, again, homebrew versions online, which are easy to use, or you can use their suggestions here. For example, the Hill Baboons, you can honestly just switch them, in my opinion, with an ape from 5th edition. If you want to be a purist, you can design your own versions of them or make them essentially, it says first level fighters, but you can use, human warriors and just call them baboon warriors if you want. Either way works. Now, this venture also comes with a local region map. I'll note, as someone who's run this adventure, you can see the Lucky Monkey to the west. It's about a day away. This is a good opportunity to do a random encounter, or at least potentially put one in down on somewhere in this area on the road. You can use the system in 5th edition where on an 18 to 20, there is a random encounter. It's not something you have to do, but it gives you the option if they're going to Lucky Monkey or coming back. Some of these locations don't come into play as much until the next couple adventures, specifically Red Gorge, the Demon Scar. They eventually go to Crazy Jared's hut. They might go to the lair of Hookface eventually. And some of these other locations are on the way to different locations that come into play later. Like the ruins of Shatterhorn is one of the latter, I think it's actually the second to last adventure. The players could go out there, but it might be really dangerous. But they would essentially have the lead for it, or it might be something they're interested in. As we go further here, we do get some more information on the city, although there's a lot more information in Life's Bazaar if you need it. There's some little bits about the Ebon Triad, which is essentially the conspirators in this adventure that are working against the cage rights or working with the cage rights to do what they're going to do, which comes into play later. Now, I'll note here as well, on top of the information on the town, these adventures are great because they have a really good rumor table. I would definitely use this in your adventure. I would even use it several times each adventure. For example, Alec Tercival is a paladin of St. Cuthbert. He's in Red Gorge, and he is the lead for one of the future adventures. I don't remember if it's the next one or the one after, but he is definitely someone of extreme importance. And this is a great seed for an upcoming adventure. Hookface does show up. I think it's the next one. He's like a young red dragon and he attacks the players. So throwing that name in or the idea that there's a red dragon in the area early is a great way to introduce him early and then have the players actually encounter him later. There's also a lot of things the players can follow here that are false leads that might lead them, with this kobold lead, for example, it might lead to some kobolds on a side quest, or they might end up trying to go into the lake to hunt down a lake monster, or into some side cave where there's not much there, or just on a false lead like this aquatic druid lead, which is fake. The other thing I'll note here, since third edition did really well, is it gives you information on the different people in the town, what the assets are in the town, such as if they want to buy and sell items, what the population is. Many of these NPCs are people that will come into play later in the campaign at one point or another. So there's a good amount of information, for these NPCs, although not necessarily in this adventure. Like the Temple of Joss comes into play later as a main adversary. So introducing Ike Iverson, the lesser cleric, early would be a good move. The players will definitely encounter him later. So, and he's definitely going to be more of a threat. Uh, Artis Shemwick, this human fence, is somebody who shows up later in this adventure as well. If a player is a rogue, they might actually know this guy. Maybe they hang out at the Tip Tankard, and then there's a whole bunch of individuals here that are just listed here as names, but they're really good NPCs. And again, there's a lot more information on them throughout the campaign, and the DM can look ahead to kind of read up on them and how to use them throughout the adventure. Again, Vortimax Weir is the potion maker. He's definitely somebody who the players will encounter over and over again. He showed up numerous times in my campaign. My group spent most of their time at the drowning Morkoth. I think I might have called it the drunken Morkoth at one point. Use either name, it's fine. And all the different clerics here in town might be like Christoph Jurgensen, the high cleric of Pelor, or a cleric of Pelor. He's not very high level. Would definitely come in handy. Some of these clerics, by the way, could be even hired to help the player characters, not just by healing potions from them. A fourth level cleric hired in this case might be somebody who's right at the same level as they are. The DM could even, you could use a standard priest build from the Monsters Manual, or have Christoph Jurgensen be built as a full player character NPC, which could come into play multiple times. Now, again, the guards might show up as well. The guards become more important as the campaign goes on. So, skipping past the rumors, though, in this adventure, the weather is very important. I would note that it should start kind of as being very cloudy and clear that the weather is changing, it's growing cooler, but the rain doesn't start yet. This sets up a really good mood for the adventure as well. As you go into chapter 1, you get, the player characters getting a message from Jenya Eurakis for the Temple of St. Cuthbert. And they can receive a sending spell from her or just a message from one of her acolytes. The player characters would have saved some of their acolytes in the first adventure, so this is a great opportunity to bring one of them back as just, an agent of hers. They're summoned to her temple, a place they've probably been before, and she gives them some good information about where to go, what's happening, where the lucky monkey is. If some of the players are not native to Cauldron, they've likely stayed the night there on the way to Cauldron, so that it's something they'd be moderately familiar with, and they might even have a rough idea of the layout of the inn, or at least the downstairs and most of it and part of the upstairs, like the room they stayed at. This could also be a really good tie-in to say, oh, you remember staying there, 10 days ago, so you could say the player stayed in a very specific room, and that's a great tie-in for to remind the characters this is actually a place they've been before, just before the campaign began. Now, there is some good event information on what's happening here. There is the first player character handout ascending from Sarkham. Although this version is very low res, the DM might just want to type this out for them, because you could copy and paste or cut this version out and share it with your player characters. But again, the resolution is really low unless you're using the actual Dungeon Magazine issue or the campaign book. The players can be offered 5,000 gold for this adventure, but Genya Arrakis won't offer it unless they ask for it. It's kind of like, are the players willing to do, a good deed? And well, big surprise, most players will probably want to get paid for this. Most of my players were willing to do it just out of the goodness of their heart, but two of them insisted on being paid and a large amount of gold, so this gold came into play in my campaign. That's not that surprising, though. Now, as the players take the quest, which they likely will, if they don't, they can do side quests or who knows what else, and then the events will play out anyways. The players eventually go to the Lucky Monkey. Here's an image of it that can also be a handout. The only problem with it is it has numbered text on it, so players are going to probably wonder what number 5 is or number 4 is. It's kind of the issue with this. You could probably take this stuff out in Photoshop very easily, though, but it is meant to be a handout. And as the players go there, there's a chance, as I said earlier, for a random encounter. This might be a really good option, random encounter wise, for introducing, a hostile encounter with, say, dinosaurs. In fact, there's literally a blood trail leading off to, I think, number 5, where some Dinosauriuses or Velociraptors or something like that are, have killed a bunch of people. Or I think there's a bunch of bodies of the people who are at the end. They're out in the forest, and there's some creatures like that feeding on the remains, and the players will likely see that and get to encounter some of them. But being able to encounter dinosaurs throughout the campaign is kind of a unique thing about having a campaign in Cauldron. It's kind of like having a campaign in Chult in Forgotten Realms. Most of the time, dinosaurs don't exist in most areas, but it could also be a good idea for introducing a type of monster that shows up in a later campaign, like some sort of lesser demon, or just something. If you want to look ahead in the adventures and pull something out, it's kind of an intro to something that happens in the line. It's like foreshadowing. But as you see here, you get the handout for this inn. The players kind of come to the inn itself. And one of the things I like about this adventure, the Lucky Monkey, is such a unique design. It's essentially a dungeon crawl, but it's using a uniquely designed inn that's quite large for the dungeon crawl, which is makes the adventure stand out quite a bit. It does have a small basement, which is probably for the best because it is kind of a dungeon crawl to begin with. Again, the players might be fairly familiar with it. They wouldn't know all the back rooms where the kitchens are, but they might know the common room pretty well. And as you see by the upstairs, you could even note that, oh, the players, two of them stayed in room 36, this room over here, where my arrow is pointing, if you can see it, or some of these other rooms. So they might have some familiarity to begin with here, which ties them into the adventure, at least from earlier. As you note, there's also this central area that's open to the sky, and there's like a bridge right here on the upper level. It's a very unique design, but quite interesting as a result. As you're going through the Lucky Monkey and you've given the handout, you'll note that a lot of the creatures here's the Dino Nicuses, I think they're called, which were in the third edition Monsters Manual. I'm sure you can find something in fifth edition that will correspond to them. They're essentially like the Velociraptors from Jurassic Park, which is fine. You'll find that a lot of the creatures here and you encounter are a bunch of mercenaries, that are pretty low level. Most of them can be replaced with either bandits or human warriors or, you know, spies if you want to use something that's more like a rogue with sneak attack. This is stuff you can find in the Monsters Manual, and I would actually recommend, since these people were hired out of Cauldron, if any of the players are from Cauldron, they might actually know some of these people. They may know, Jendi here might be someone they grew up with, or Nasher might be an old, acquaintance from their childhood who they never got along with to begin with. But it's a good emphasis for players that are from Cauldron that these people are themselves hired from Cauldron and are basically here as mercenaries or thugs, hired by the main villain here and essentially working for Tongue Eater as well, who's the boss at this location. As you go through the adventure, there are a couple of creatures as well that I'll note when you kind of get to them here. For example, there's baboons or hill baboons, but just use apes if you want for them. There's the were baboon image of Tongue Eater. It's very unique that he's a were baboon compared to anything else. Although you can build him quite easily as essentially a berserker and well, he's an orc, so or half orc. He could be an orc berserker and essentially give him the were rat traits. I mean, he shouldn't be that much more powerful than a were rat, anyways. Only if you get bit, you turn into a were baboon instead. The DM could customize it a little bit more if you want, but usually that should be fine. You see, most of the rooms don't actually have encounters in them. Their players can just explore the inn. Shen Shen is an NPC that comes into play in the latter part of the adventure. She's in the basement with the body of Sarkham. Again, eventually the players will encounter Tongue Eater himself. I'll note, by the way, he has a number of potions on him. Potions of Magic Fame, for example, don't exist in 5th edition, but the Potion of Enlarge should. The Potion of Jumping, I believe, does, and the Cure Light Wounds potion is just a healing potion. Make sure you have him drink some of these potions, and this is a great opportunity to be using the mixing potions table and showing what it can do or what might happen. You might want to switch out the Hayward's Handy Haversack for just a bag of holding. It's up to the DM. I actually think it's interesting that he has this, but there's quite a few enemies that have something like this in the adventure. You don't need to have the items here be masterwork. They can just be regular studded leather. And it was some of these potions, if you don't want to bring them into your campaign, just switch them out for something similar or just some other potion that's a common or uncommon potion in 5th edition if you're running it in 5th edition, which again, I ran it in 5th edition. As you go further in, there's some information on Senshin. She is made to be, in this adventure, a reoccurring NPC. And when you see her stat block, you'll note she is a bard, monk, druid, which is really unusual. I think it was probably unusual to begin with. I would suggest building her as a full NPC with a character sheet and have her continue to be an NPC, or at least have the players use her as an optional NPC. And you'll get all her information, including her stat block and all that. And that's what I did with my campaign. And she was an NPC for quite a few adventures until she got herself killed. Now, again, we get hill baboons as we go down here. We get more, fighters and bandits, or what do you call them? Further in the adventure, the inn is filled with these people. They're all mercenaries. You get some brown mold. You get Senshen and her various stats and some of her equipment. If you want, like I said, the Wand of Entangle, you could bring this into your campaign as an uncommon wand. It does open the door for player characters, expecting these to be in other campaigns, or the DM could just say is just kind of a unique item that maybe she has. As you go further in, you get the image of Shen Shen. I would definitely show this image. She's kind of unique. She's a half drow, and you know, adds a little bit of a different character to the adventure. I thought she was kind of interesting just because of her odd combination of classes, which gives her some really unique abilities. She fills the role of the person or the character that literally fills the empty spaces. Like if you don't have a bard in your group, her being a first level bard when she starts is going to be really useful. Her having some monk abilities and some druid abilities is going to add some spell casting to your player characters group. If they don't have that, she's uh, a great fill in the gap NPC. Now, as you go further in, it does note the Church of Ouija should be a campaign seed. There should be some information on them later, where the players might encounter them. Um, she's a she's a follower of Flame. I can't remember his name, but she's the Striders of Flare Lang. Sorry, she's a follower of the Striders of Flare Lang. The players have likely encountered a couple of them in the first adventure, whether it went hostile or not, like it did in my game. And they become a little more important because of her in the campaign, but they never become really important. But the Church of Ouija does become more important, and again, adding in the one of their clerics early on, or someone who might follow them, might be kind of important. You could even add in an apprentice wizard, for example, as one of the NPCs or one of the hostile enemies here that follows Weejoss and might have a symbol of theirs or something like that. It just as a little seed for later on that the players will probably remember. Now, as you go on further, it becomes evident that the player characters do not find all the wands when they defeat Tongue Eater and everyone else. You could put one of the wands in if you want, but they're not necessary here. Um, the chapter 3 at this point goes into well, it becomes a very different adventure. The player characters begin doing a lot of role playing and digging around about what's happening, and there's some events that take place in the city that's very important. Notable, the player characters will leave the Lucky Monkey, they'll head back to Cauldron. There's the chance of an encounter, but it's not super likely on the road. When they get back, that's when the rains should really begin, and implying that this storyline of the flood season isn't over, and they've returned without the wands, most likely. In fact, there's no way they can get all the wands, obviously, by this point. Now, when they get back, there is a festival underway that's being put together called the Flood Festival. This is kind of a unique cultural aspect of Cauldron. They celebrate the floods, or at least do some activity about it. Maybe it's they do it as an omen, or to that makes hopefully the rains won't be too bad, so they like burn offerings to some deity, or or they pay homage to them this in this weird way. But it's an interesting aspect of the city, and it's also a great opportunity for role playing. You could say that there are literally booths and tents being set up because it's probably involves people going indoors a lot. There's most likely entertainers like, say, clowns in the area. You could have other bards that are low level in the area. Maybe if there's a bard in the party, the bard might have some connections here where they might interact with some other bars in the city. You could do jugglers, mimes. I thought it'd be a cool encounter since they brought in the space clowns with Spelljammer. The players might encounter in a weird alleyway a space clown amongst the other ordinary clowns as a just kind of a weird random encounter. But this is a really good opportunity to allow time to pass as the flood season really does begin. The DM does not have to move directly into the second half of the adventure. I would actually have the players follow some of the rumors they've heard, or get in some side adventures, or maybe they do look into and try to investigate what's happening after returning to the Temple of St. Cuthbert, where again they're going to get paid, and allow a little bit of time to pass. This is also a good opportunity for a little bit of downtime and allow the tension to build. And over the next, 10-day or so, you could note that the water level of the lake is rising, although many of the buildings, like the tip tankard, are on small stilts down by the lake. So the players might notice this, that, okay, well, the wands are needed and things are going to get worse. And maybe every 5 days the water level increases by another foot or another couple of feet. The players will notice this more and more, especially if the DM does 2 or 3 little side adventures in Cauldron, which gives them a little bit of XP and all that, and is also gives them some time to sell some of, or spend some of the gold they made and sell off loose items they found on their adventures. Now, as time goes on, maybe a week or two after the rain has really begun, the mood is changing. Maybe after the flood festival event happens, The players will eventually get to the main, or the second half of the quest, leading to trying to find the wands themselves. Now, there is a lead here called the Red Haired Woman, which is tied to Senshen, where she might have some information that connects to well, the main villain in the story and some other individuals that might lead them further deeper into the adventure. Notably, Triel Elderast here, who had some a dark past in the city. The players might, as they note here, investigate the prisoners. They might use divination magic. My player characters investigated or essentially interrogated Tongue Eater, kept him alive, and got some information from him. This is a really good opportunity, by the way, to give them a false lead and send them out of the city. And with the players not realizing it's a false lead, you could send them just in a completely different direction off to the east towards there's a small town called Hollow Sky to the east of Cauldron. Send them out there towards some random location that goes nowhere. They'll realize that Tongue Eater is lying, and it will allow some time to pass if you do that. But again, divination magic is a great idea. Just using locate object or an augury spell. If any of the players choose to do this, they can do all kinds of different options here, and the adventure provides ideas with that. But again, using the different churches in the city, the Church of Cord, the Church of Pelor, might be really useful to this time. Have the players interact a lot with the various NPCs, and maybe even pick up little bits of information or other rumors that might actually go somewhere. Now, eventually, the players are going to get more information that will lead them to the Kopru Ruins, which is the second half of the adventure, the main second half. You could call it third part, which is underneath Cauldron itself. It's one of those caverns on the side map in the beginning of the adventure where it's partially flooded or at least have some water in it. This is the map of that area, and you can see it's quite unique and quite diverse. And these doors, by the way, are really weird. They're they open in the middle, and they're like turning doors made of stone, which is really complicated to do on roll 20 if you try it. I did try that, and it worked, but it was complicated. Eventually, the player characters, if they don't have a good lead of their own, the adventure provides event 4, where the fence, Artis Shemwick, down by the tip tankard, will contact them with some information he has concerning the location of the Copra ruins and the main villain, Triel, as he has a connection with her. And, he'll give them that information. Well, he won't give it to them, but he'll offer to sell it to them, which also gives them something to spend some money on. But they could probably just, role play the information out of him if they're really good at doing things like that, or interrogate him if they really don't want to pay any money. Again, he is a good NPC and he's a fence, so he's likely to come in multiple times in the campaign. He's someone that the players are less likely to just murder if they're like that. Some of my players were, not all of them, but he will likely give them, if they don't haven't found it on their own, the lead to the Kopu ruins. Now, as you go into the ruins, again, you get these weird doors. It notes them right there. You get a really good descriptions here of where they can go. The ruins are very different from a standard adventure, which is unique. You don't get a description for every different room, which is fine. You don't need it for every one of them, but you get some good, text descriptions for the player characters. And again, a lot of these are creatures you can just, switch out these guys for human warriors. Like I said, I did a version of the Skolvin you can find online, or just do your own. There's this kind of subpar illustration, dark illustration. I don't think it's that good, but it's all right. And there's some just different things that players encounter. The Coprus, for example, there is a 5e homebrew version of Coprus that you can find online. I think I used that version. As you go further in, there's a number of kind of simple traps. Most of these are self-explanatory. There are some 5e versions of the pits, for example. There's some secret doors. There's more of these human bandit rogues that you can use. The Mudslade, for example, is not a creature from 5th edition, but there's a 5e homebrew version of it that you can use. That works just fine. I use that version, I believe. Some more imageries of some of the villains. As you go further in, more human warriors, human rogues, those sort of things. Again, more of those bandits or a different group of those bandits that the players encounter. As you go even further in, you'll get to this individual, this halfling Skaven Umbermead. He's a halfling diviner. You can use the illusionist build from Volo's Guide and just switch out his spells for more divination spells or more spells from this list. Some of these spells don't exist in 5th edition, so just pick and choose and kind of rework them. This is a good example for a wizard in your group to end up with a new spell book. And there's things like the bracers of armor +1. You could switch that for just bracers of armor, and it would be fine. The Pearl of Powers in 5th edition. A wand of mage armor isn't in 5th edition, so you might want to switch that out with something else, like a wand of magic missile or something. And the medium air elemental, you could just use a regular air elemental, and it should be fine at this level. This spell, Sepia Snake Sigils, you might want to just kind of build a new version of it. It's not a current spell, but it is somewhat interesting. And again, more traps, some different spiders. These smaller spiders, you might want to you might be able to find some 5e versions of small monster spiders instead of them being tiny. But ettercaps, medium-sized spiders, large spiders, those are all things that are in 5th edition already. And the harpoon spider is a little different, though. There is I think, a version online that's a homebrew version of this spider. This is a creature that was introduced in this adventure that is kind of a standout creature a little bit. I used a 5e homebrew version myself. As you continue in the adventure, you do eventually get to the main boss fight here with Trial Elderast, which is where you might show that opening image of her, depending on how your DMing style is. I would personally build her as a custom built warrior and cleric, and just make her a 3rd level cleric, give her those kind of spells, give her healing words so she has some bonus actions, and give her some abilities that a 4th level fighter might have, or, build her as a dual class character, because she is really the main boss and she's someone who's very going to be very important. Again, the whole +1 spiked full plate when her armor looks like it does. The DM might want to switch that out as just partial armor or something similar. You could do a lot of things with it, unless you just want to completely change it so it doesn't have anything to do with that opening image. And again, most of these items you can switch out if you're playing 5th edition with 5th edition items, or just a replacement item if you want. Here's some more, human rogue bandits, things like that. More traps, some more bandits. Again, most of these, you're going to use a lot of bandits. The one thing I will note would be kind of difficult to find is this bloater ooze swarm. It's a unique creature from 3rd edition. If you're a purist and you're running 5th edition, you can build it from scratch. I don't think there's a version online, but there might be at this point. Or you could just switch it out with another ooze, like just a red version of a gray ooze with some slightly different traits. It's not that powerful of a creature, so it doesn't matter that much in the adventure. And then, again, more of this stuff, more empty rooms for exploration as you continue on. Some of the back chambers are a little more interesting. You get a gargantuan T-Rex skeleton. Definitely use this creature. It's going to be a lot of fun for the player characters, and it fits the theme in this region. I think there's a version of the T-Rex skeleton online anyway, so just use that. Or if there's not that, there's definitely a homebrew version, because I remember I found a copy of it. That's a very memorable encounter in this adventure. Large monster spider zombies. I think I found a version of them online that I was able to use. I was homebrew, and then getting to the end of the adventure, spawns of chaoses are in 5th edition. There's a glyph of warding, actual regular zombies, and eventually you're going to get to this Null Hecuva creature, which is an undead spellcaster. I found a homebrew version of the Hecuva and just modified it. You don't need to give it a ranger level, in my opinion, or a fighter level. It's probably fine just as a Hecuva, and maybe give it some Null-like traits, although it is undead. Just, make it look like a Null, and again, you can give it some of these magic items. I think I switched some of them out because I thought there were too many wands in the adventure, and I wanted to put some different items in. I think I kept the +1 chainmail more to annoy my players with a type of armor they would definitely never use that was magical, and they probably sold it for something. The closet's easy to bring in. In the end, for this adventure, though, as you're concluding it, the player characters will likely find most, if not all, the wands. It could be an open storyline that there is a wand or two missing that they need to look for, or that might show up later in the adventure. But once they have the wands, the water can more or less be controlled. But here we go, the concluding the adventure. And this is the original third edition stat blocks for the harpoon spider. Definitely use this image unless you find another one, because the harpoon spider is one of the more unique creatures in this adventure. Again, there's some information in third edition of how to do a werebaboon. This isn't really used for fifth, so you don't need to use it unless you're playing third edition. Now, for this adventure, in conclusion, there are quite a few magic items that are not in fifth edition throughout this adventure. I noted this. I would simply replace a lot of them with fifth edition items, unless, especially with all the wands. There's so many wands in this adventure that the enemies have. It becomes too many wands, in my opinion. Switch them out with something a little more interesting, maybe. That's kind of one of the criticisms I have on this adventure. I would say on a scale of 1 out of 5, this is a 5-star adventure. It is one of the best in the series. I think it's actually superior to Life's Bazaar, which itself is a good adventure to begin with. It has two different dungeon crawl like locations. The first one is again very unique, being a uniquely designed inn, and you know, there's some potential random encounters that could happen. There's a lot of NPCs that could be encountered between the two major sections of the adventure, and the second part of the adventure is a large underground dungeon crawl with a lot of interesting threats. And this campaign sort of sets things up for part of the ongoing story later, as there's a lot of things happening in the background around Cauldron, and it just leads the player characters towards eventually their next direction. And the main villain in this story is definitely, she's up to something and no good for a reason. She's working for someone, which the DM will learn more about. I believe it's connected to the what do they call, the Ebon Triad, which come into play later. But overall, it's a very good adventure, and it's one of the best adventures in Shackled City. I'd highly recommend it. And when the players do get here, and there are quite a few good adventures that continue throughout this particular storyline, which I'll review at a later time.